February 7, 1979. Sao Paulo, Brazil. Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, who conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners including children, suffers a stroke while swimming at a beach resort. He drowns in shallow water at age 67, his body buried under the false name Wolfgang Gerhard in a Brazilian cemetery. For 34 years after World War II ended, Mengele had evaded justice, living comfortably in South America, while Holocaust survivors and their families searched desperately for the man who had tortured and murdered thousands. But here's what most people don't know. When Mengele fled to South America in 1949, he didn't just leave behind his crimes. He left behind a wife, a son, and a family business in Germany that would become one of the most successful manufacturing companies in Bavaria. What happened to Josef Mengele's family after the war is a story more morally complex than almost any other Nazi legacy, because unlike Himmler's daughter, who spent her life defending her father, or Goering's daughter, who lived in denial, Mengele's son made a choice that still resonates today. He publicly acknowledged his father's crimes, changed his name, broke all contact with the Mengele family business, and dedicated his life to being as different from his father as humanly possible. This is the story of how the family of Auschwitz's most notorious doctor responded to a legacy of medical torture and genocide, how a wife who divorced him still defended him decades later, how a son who barely knew his father spent his adult life trying to escape his shadow, and how the Mengele family business thrived in post-war Germany, despite, or perhaps because of, its careful distance from the family's most infamous member. To understand what happened after, we need to understand who Josef Mengele was before becoming the Angel of Death. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, Bavaria. The Mengele family owned a farm equipment manufacturing company that by the 1920s had become one of Bavaria's most successful businesses, employing hundreds of workers and generating substantial wealth. Josef was the eldest of three sons. His brothers Karl Jr. and Alois would eventually take over the family business, while Josef pursued medicine. Josef Mengele earned his PhD in anthropology from the University of Munich in 1935 and his medical degree in 1938 from the University of Frankfurt. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1938. His academic interests in genetics and racial theory aligned perfectly with Nazi ideology about Aryan superiority. In 1939, Josef married Irene Schönbein, the daughter of a wealthy Günzburg businessman. The couple appeared to be the perfect Nazi family, educated, wealthy, committed to the regime's ideology. On May 30, 1943, Josef Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz concentration camp, where he would remain until January 17, 1945. During those 21 months, Mengele earned his nickname, the Angel of Death, by personally selecting which prisoners arriving on trains would be sent immediately to gas chambers and which would be kept alive for forced labor or medical experiments. Mengele's true obsession was his medical experiments, particularly on twins. He conducted horrific experiments on approximately 3,000 twins, most of them children, trying to understand twin genetics so the Nazis could increase the Aryan birth rate. These experiments included injecting chemicals into children's eyes to try to change their color, amputating limbs without anesthesia, and performing surgeries without medical justification. Fewer than 200 of the twins survived. Survivors testified that Mengele would bring candy to the children before subjecting them to torture, creating a psychological horror that haunted them for life. While Josef was at Auschwitz in 1944, his wife Irene gave birth to their only child, a son named Rolf, born on March 11, 1944. Josef saw his son only briefly before returning to Auschwitz. By the time the war ended on May 8, 1945, Josef Mengele was in hiding, using false identity papers under the name Fritz Holman and beginning the process of planning his escape from Europe. Irene and infant Rolf were back in Günzburg, living with the Mengele family, facing an uncertain future as American forces occupied Bavaria and began investigating Nazi war criminals. What happened to this family would reveal how different people respond when confronted with a legacy of unspeakable evil. The wife who divorced him but never stopped defending him. When World War II ended, Irene Mengele was 30 years old, living in Günzburg with infant Rolf. Unlike wives of other high-ranking Nazis who were immediately arrested, Irene initially escaped Allied attention because Josef Mengele was not yet identified as a major war criminal being actively pursued. Mengele had destroyed much of his research and successfully assumed a false identity as Fritz Hollmann, working as a farmhand while hiding among millions of displaced persons in southern Germany. His name didn't appear on initial major wanted lists in 1945 and 1946, partly because the full scope of his Auschwitz crimes was still being documented through survivor testimonies. The Mengele Farm Equipment Company, run by Josef's brothers Karl Jr. and Alois, actually thrived in post-war Germany because agricultural machinery was desperately needed. The company had not been involved in armaments or slave labor programs that would have triggered seizure. But Irene faced a different problem. She was married to a man in hiding who couldn't safely contact her without risking arrest. Between 1945 and 1948, Josef sent only occasional secret messages through intermediaries. By 1947, as the Cold War developed and West Germany became a strategic ally, denazification efforts were being relaxed, but not for those accused of mass murder and medical torture. Josef realized he could never safely return to Germany and began planning to flee to South America, where networks of Nazi sympathizers were helping war criminals establish new identities. In 1948, Josef communicated to Irene that he would be leaving Europe permanently and that she should consider their marriage over. In early 1949, Josef Mengele used the Ratline network, escape routes run by sympathetic Catholic clergy, former SS officers, and right-wing organizations, to flee through Italy to Argentina, arriving in Buenos Aires in May 1949, using papers under the name Helmut Gregor. He was 38, starting a new life in South America, leaving behind his wife and 5-year-old son Rolf, whom he would not see again for 28 years. Irene remained in Günzburg, raising Rolf with financial support from the family business. The Mengele brothers quietly sent Josef money through Swiss bank accounts throughout the 1950s and 1960s. This meant Josef never had to work particularly hard in South America. He lived primarily off money sent from Germany, blood money, funding the comfortable exile of the Angel of Death. In 1954, merely 10 years after the war ended, Irene divorced Josef. The divorce was finalized on March 25, 1954, on grounds of abandonment. But here's what makes this divorce significant. Irene didn't denounce Josef, didn't cooperate with authorities, and didn't publicly acknowledge his crimes. The divorce was practical, allowing her to remarry, but it wasn't a moral repudiation. Evidence that emerged later revealed Irene maintained emotional defense of Josef even after divorcing him, telling young Rolf that his father had been a doctor who served Germany and that accusations against him were exaggerated. Just months after her divorce, Irene married Alfons Hackenjoss, a successful Günzburg businessman, and became Irene Hackenjoss, attempting to publicly distance herself from the Mengele connection. But Irene's relationship with Josef's legacy was more complicated than a simple divorce suggested. In the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, as international attention focused on hunting down Nazi war criminals, Irene was occasionally questioned by German authorities about her ex-husband's whereabouts. Her consistent response was that she had no contact with him, didn't know where he was, and had moved on with her life. These statements were likely true in a narrow, technical sense, but they were also convenient lies of omission, because she almost certainly knew, through the Mengele family network, that Josef was in South America. Young Rolf, growing up in Günzburg in the 1950s and early 1960s, knew his biological father was Josef Mengele and that his father had been a doctor in the war, but he didn't fully understand the nature of his father's crimes until he was a teenager. Irene and the Mengele family apparently made a collective decision to shield Rolf from the full truth, telling him sanitized versions that portrayed Josef as a military doctor who had done his duty and was now being persecuted. This narrative of Josef as victim rather than perpetrator would shape Rolf's early understanding and create psychological conflicts that would eventually force him to confront painful truths. The son who sought the truth and broke with his father, Rolf Mengele, grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in Gunsberg as Rolf Jenkel, having taken his stepfather's surname, later simplified to further distance himself from the Mengele name. He attended local schools, lived a comfortable middle-class life, and was largely shielded from the full truth about his biological father. But in 1959, when Rolf was 15 years old, everything changed. That year, the West German government issued an arrest warrant for Josef Mengele for murder and crimes against humanity, based on extensive testimony from Auschwitz survivors. The case received international media attention. Newspapers published Josef Mengele's photograph, and suddenly, the Mengele name was front-page news across Germany. Rolf couldn't escape the truth anymore. His classmates knew who his father was. Teachers looked at him differently, and he began to understand that his father wasn't just a wartime doctor, but was accused of being one of the worst Nazi war criminals still at large. According to later interviews, Rolf's initial reaction was confusion and denial, but unlike Gudrun Himmler or Edda Goering, Rolf didn't have years of childhood bonding with his father to create strong emotional loyalty, having last seen Josef when he was barely a year old in 1945. Throughout the 1960s, as Rolf completed his education and entered adulthood, the international manhunt for Josef Mengele intensified. In 1960, Israeli Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires, proving that Nazi war criminals could be found and brought to justice even decades after the war. This created enormous pressure on the Mengele family in Gunsberg, with journalists staking out the family business and German authorities repeatedly questioning family members. The Mengele brothers maintained their public position that they had no contact with Josef, while privately continuing to send him financial support. Rolf, now in his 20s and trying to build his own life, was caught between two impossible positions: loyalty to a father he didn't really know versus acknowledgement of crimes so horrific they seemed incomprehensible. In 1968, when Rolf was 24 years old, he made a decision that would change his relationship with the Mengele legacy forever. He demanded to meet his father face to face, to hear directly from Josef about the accusations, and to determine for himself whether his father was the monster the world claimed or the victim his family suggested. The Mengele family, through intermediaries, arranged for Rolf to travel to Brazil, where Josef had been living since 1961, after fleeing Argentina due to increased scrutiny following Eichmann's capture. In October 1977, Rolf Mengele flew to Sao Paulo, Brazil, using his assumed name, Rolf Jenkel, and met his father for the first time since infancy. The meeting took place at a secluded farmhouse, where Josef was living under the protection of Hungarian expatriates who were Nazi sympathizers. According to Rolf's later testimony, the meeting lasted several days, and what transpired would determine Rolf's position on his father's legacy for the rest of his life. Rolf later described his father as unrepentant, defensive, and still committed to Nazi racial ideology, even 32 years after the war ended. When Rolf confronted Josef directly about the medical experiments at Auschwitz, about the testimonies of survivors who described him selecting prisoners for gas chambers and conducting torturous experiments on children, Josef's response was chilling in its complete lack of remorse. According to Rolf's account, Josef claimed he had only been following orders, that his experiments were scientifically justified, that he had actually helped many prisoners by selecting them for work details, and that the accusations against him were exaggerated. Josef showed no guilt, no acknowledgement that what he had done was morally wrong, no empathy for the thousands of victims who suffered under his experiments. This meeting, which Rolf had hoped would provide some kind of explanation, or perhaps even remorse, instead confirmed Rolf's worst fears. His father was indeed the monster that history described, and there would be no redemption, no excuse, no way to maintain both truth and family loyalty simultaneously. Wolf returned to Germany after the meeting and made a choice that differentiated him from almost every other close relative of major Nazi war criminals. He would publicly acknowledge his father's crimes, would refuse to defend them, and would cooperate with authorities trying to locate Josef, though by the time he made this decision, it was already too late. The death of a monster and a son's public reckoning on February 7, 1979, just 16 months after Rolf's meeting with his father in Brazil, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach resort near Sao Paulo and drowned. He was 67 years old and had lived 34 years in freedom after escaping Europe, never facing trial, never being held accountable for the torture and murder of thousands at Auschwitz. His body was buried in a cemetery in Embu das Artes under the false name Wolfgang Gerhardt, the identity he had been using in Brazil since 1971. For the next 6 years, the world believed Josef Mengele was still alive, and international manhunts continued with Israeli intelligence, German prosecutors, and Nazi hunters pursuing leads across South America. But Rolf Mengele knew the truth, having been informed of his father's death through the same network of intermediaries that had arranged the 1977 meeting. And he faced an excruciating moral dilemma. Should he reveal that his father was dead, thereby ending the manhunt, but also potentially exposing himself and the Mengele family to legal consequences? For 6 years, from 1979 to 1985, Rolf kept silent about his father's death, a decision he would later describe as the greatest moral failure of his life. During this period, enormous resources was spent searching for a man who was already dead and buried in Brazil. Holocaust survivors continued to live with the trauma of knowing their torturer had escaped justice. In 1985, the pressure finally broke when German authorities, having obtained new evidence about the Mengele family's financial support of Josef, threatened prosecution if they continued to obstruct the investigation. On May 31, 1985, police raided the home of Hans Sednemeyer, a longtime Mengele family friend who had served as the primary intermediary for sending money to Josef in South America, and discovered documents proving that Josef had died in 1979 and was buried in Brazil under a false name. On June 6, 1985, the body, buried as Wolfgang Gerhardt, was exhumed from the Embu das Artes cemetery. Forensic experts from Brazil, Germany, the United States, and Israel examined the remains using dental records and bone structure analysis. On June 21, 1985, the forensic team announced with high confidence that the remains were indeed those of Josef Mengele. In 1992, DNA samples from the remains were compared to blood samples from Rolf Mengele and his son, Josef's grandson, and the match was definitive. The angel of death had died in 1979 and had escaped earthly justice. For Holocaust survivors and their families, the news that Mengele had died peacefully in Brazil, never standing trial, never facing his victims, was devastating. But for Rolf Mengele, the revelation of his father's death and his own 6-year silence about it created a crisis that forced him to make a public accounting of his position on his father's legacy. In the months following the exhumation, Rolf gave several interviews to German and international media, and what he said represented a remarkable break from the pattern of denial that characterized most Nazi family members. In a televised interview with German public broadcaster ARD in November 1985, Rolf stated clearly, "My father committed terrible crimes. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. I cannot and will not defend what he did. I am horrified by his actions and ashamed to be his son." This public acknowledgement of his father's crimes, combined with his visible remorse for having concealed Josef's death for 6 years, set Rolf apart from figures like Gudrun Himmler or Edda Goering, who spent their lives in denial. But Rolf went even further. He publicly broke ties with the Mengele family business, changed his name legally to distance himself from the Mengele connection, and made a conscious decision to live as privately as possible while acknowledging rather than denying historical truth. In 1986, Rolf published a memoir titled Life Father, Josef Mengele, in collaboration with German journalists describing his 1977 meeting with Josef in Brazil and his father's complete lack of remorse. The memoir was controversial because some critics argued that Rolf was profiting from his father's infamy, while others praised him for providing honest testimony that didn't excuse or minimize Josef's crimes. Rolf donated a portion of the book's proceeds to Holocaust education organizations, a gesture acknowledging that while he couldn't undo his father's crimes or his own silence about Josef's death, he could at least contribute to ensuring those crimes were remembered. Throughout the late 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s, Rolf maintained a low profile, working as a lawyer in Germany under his assumed name, avoiding most media requests, but occasionally giving interviews on significant anniversaries or when documentary filmmakers needed testimony about Josef Mengele's post-war life. In these interviews, Rolf was consistently clear about his position. He acknowledged his father's crimes, expressed shame and horror at what Josef had done, but also spoke honestly about the psychological complexity of being the son of such a monster. The legacy of choice and the questions that haunt us. The contrast between Rolf Mengele's path and that of other Nazi descendants like Gudrun Himmler reveals something profound about human agency and moral choice in the face of inherited evil. While Gudrun spent 73 years defending her father and helping SS war criminals escape justice, Rolf spent his adult life acknowledging his father's crimes and grappling publicly with the shame and complexity of being Josef Mengele's son. But there's another dimension to the Mengele family story that complicates our moral evaluation. The Mengele family business in Günzburg continued to thrive throughout the post-war period and into the 21st century, becoming one of Bavaria's most successful agricultural machinery manufacturers. The Mengele brothers, Karl Jr. and Alois, ran the company successfully until their deaths in 1974 and 1975, respectively, and they passed the business to the next generation of Mengeles, who had no personal connection to Josef, but inherited wealth that was partially derived from supporting a fugitive war criminal for over 30 years. The ethical questions this raises are thorny. Should the Mengele family business have been forced to pay reparations to Josef's victims? Should the company have been seized because of its connection to the Angel of Death? Most legal experts argue that the business itself committed no crimes and that punishing the company would have been collective punishment against innocent employees and family members. But the moral discomfort remains. In 2013, the company Karl Mengele and Sons still operated in Günzburg with annual revenues exceeding 100 million euros, employing over 500 people, and the Mengele descendants who owned it maintained strict silence about their infamous relative. This silence is understandable from a business perspective, but it also represents a form of evasion that stands in contrast to Rolf's willingness to speak publicly about his father's crimes. As for Rolf himself, he lived into his 60s and 70s, continuing to grapple with his father's legacy, giving occasional interviews when historical documentaries or significant anniversaries prompted renewed interest. In a 2004 interview on the 1660th anniversary of his birth, Rolf, then 60 years old, was asked whether he had ever forgiven his father. His response was profound. "Forgiveness is not mine to give. I was not my father's victim. The people he tortured and murdered, they're the only ones who could forgive, and most of them are dead. What I can do is acknowledge the truth, refuse to defend the indefensible, and try to live a life that is as different from his as possible. That's all any of us can do when we're born into a legacy of evil we didn't create." This statement encapsulates perhaps the most ethically sound position any descendant of a Nazi war criminal can take. Acknowledge truth, refuse denial, express appropriate shame, but also recognize the limits of personal responsibility for crimes committed by others. Rolf never had children, a choice he described in interviews as deliberate because he didn't want to pass the Mengele burden to another generation, creating an interesting parallel with the Stuart Houston brothers, who made a similar pact to end Hitler's bloodline. But what about Josef's first wife, Irene, who divorced him but never publicly condemned him? Irene Hackenjoss, formerly Irene Mengele, lived until September 4, 1987, dying at age 72 in Günzburg. Throughout her life, after divorcing Josef in 1954, she maintained public silence about her ex-husband, never giving interviews, never acknowledging his crimes, never expressing remorse for having been married to the angel of death. According to testimony from Rolf after her death, Irene never fully accepted that Josef had done the things he was accused of, preferring to believe either that the accusations were exaggerated or that Josef had been following orders and bore less personal responsibility than the historical record showed. This position of quiet denial, not actively defending Josef like Gudrun defended Hitler, but also not acknowledging the full truth, represents a middle ground that many family members of Nazi criminals occupied. They didn't become activists for Nazi apologia, but they also didn't face historical reality honestly. The Mengele family's divergent paths, from Rolf's painful acknowledgement to the business family's profitable silence, prove that we are not prisoners of our bloodlines, but architects of our own moral choices. If this exploration of inherited guilt and the courage to face uncomfortable truths resonates with you, subscribe now and hit the notification bell for more untold stories that reveal how legacy is not what we're given, but what we choose to carry forward or reject.